through the deafening howl of the wind, tearing apart the silence at an altitude of 3,000 meters, only one unnatural sound broke through. A rhythmic mechanical squeak that could not belong to any bird, beast, or the mountain itself. It was November 1983, at the very moment when the world, unknowingly, balanced on the thinnest edge separating cold confrontation from nuclear fire. The Alpine range, majestic and silent, seemed eternal and indestructible. A place where time froze in ice, yet it was here, far from the eyes of diplomats and television cameras, a drama unfolded that could rewrite human history. An experienced mountaineer, accidentally finding himself in a restricted sector on the border of Italy and Austria, stumbled upon an object that categorically did not fit into the wild landscape. It was a fragment of metal, unnaturally smooth, covered with frost, with markings that could not be mistaken for anything else, although they were half erased by ice chips. This discovery, like a key to Pandora's box, triggered a chain of memories and investigations leading back to the night when the mountains became an arena for a secret operation that was ordered to be forgotten even before it began. That year was particularly difficult for international politics. The air was electrified with paranoia and the anticipation of an inevitable strike, and tension between the superpowers reached a critical point where any abrupt movement could be interpreted as the beginning of the end. In the corridors of power in Washington and Moscow, an atmosphere reigned that could be described as strategic hysteria. NATO exercises codenamed Able Archer led the Soviet leadership to seriously believe that under the guise of maneuvers, the West was preparing a preemptive nuclear strike. It was in this context, in an atmosphere of total distrust and fear, that the idea for an operation was born, an operation that was supposed to give Soviet intelligence a golden key to the enemy's plans, access to a secure communication cable running deep beneath the rock formations of the seemingly neutral Alps. It was an all-in gamble, a decision dictated by desperation and the iron logic of the Cold War. Whoever possesses information controls time, and time then was measured in minutes of ballistic missile flight. The group selected for this mission did not exist in official registers. Their personal files were removed from archives, and their names were replaced with call signs taken from geology: granite, basalt, flint, mica. These were people who had undergone training beyond human capabilities, specialists for whom the high mountains were as natural a habitat as for a snow leopard. But even they could not foresee what they were about to face. Their task was not merely to penetrate an area protected by nature itself and NATO sensors, but to install an interception device that was to operate autonomously, powered by a compact isotopic energy source, and transmit data via satellite, remaining invisible to search teams. The operation was planned as a surgical intervention, with a small sabotage group serving as the scalpel, and the global security system as the patient. But, as often happens in history, the human factor and the blind fury of the elements made their adjustments to the perfectly drawn staff maps. The external layer of this conflict was apparent and crude. It was a battle of technology and physical endurance against the harsh conditions of the high mountains and the enemy's counterintelligence measures. The cable they sought was not merely a wire, but an artery through which the blood of the Western Defense Alliance flowed, and reaching it meant traversing an icy hell where temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind could knock even a trained person off their feet. The group moved at night, using night vision devices and maintaining complete radio silence. Every step meticulously calculated. For any sound, any falling stone could be detected by seismic sensors scattered across the slopes. It was a game of cat and mouse, where where the cat was the full might of NATO technology, and the mice were 5 men crawling up a sheer ice-glazed wall with backpacks laden with tens of kilograms of equipment. However, beneath this external layer of physical overcoming lay a much deeper internal conflict, tearing apart the group's commander, a man with the call sign Granite. He was a veteran of covert operations, a man accustomed to executing orders without question, but this time something had changed in the very air, in the very essence of the mission. The briefing before departure had been strange, rushed, as if those who sent them on this mission themselves didn't believe in its success or, even worse, had already written the group off, viewing them as expendable in a larger game. Granite felt the cold penetrating not only beneath his thermal underwear, but also into his soul, giving birth to doubts. Was this information truly worth the risks they were taking, or were they merely pawns, sacrificed to create the appearance of vigorous activity for the higher leadership? Each time he looked at his men, at their frost-bitten faces and determined eyes, he asked himself if he had the right to lead them further, into an area from which there might be no return. But an order is an order, and this military dogma held him tighter than any safety rope. Even deeper, at the very bottom of this layered cake of events, lay an ideological conflict, a clash of 2 philosophies, 2 worldviews that converged at this desolate point on the planet. On one side was the belief that state security justifies any means, that the lives of a few people are a negligible price for the tranquility of millions, that the goal, however elusive, is always above individual fate. On the other side stood the harsh truth of reality. The mountains, indifferent to ideologies, to communism and capitalism, to the fears of general secretaries and presidents, dictated their own laws, where the only value was life, and the only enemy was not a person in a different uniform, but cold, gravity, and time. In this icy silence, all political slogans lost their meaning, turning into empty sound carried away by the wind, and all that remained was the pure existential struggle of man for the right to take one more breath. The situation began to change imperceptibly, as often happens in the mountains. The sky, still studded with stars an hour ago, suddenly became covered with a heavy, leaden shroud, and the pressure sharply dropped, portending a storm that the locals called white darkness. But this was not the only change. The equipment they carried began to behave strangely. Sensors showed anomalous activity in the air, as if someone or something was already waiting for them at the summit. At this moment, Granite realized that their mission might have been compromised from the start, that they were not going on a secret raid, but into a prearranged trap, and that the intercepted ciphers could have been disinformation designed to lure them into this very square at this very time. This revelation hit him harder than a gust of icy wind. They were not hunters, but game being cornered, and that corner was on a narrow ledge above a kilometer-deep abyss. The situation transformed instantaneously when the first discharge of static electricity swept across the rocks, and a storm of such ferocity began that it seemed as if the heavens themselves had decided to fall upon the earth. Visibility dropped to 0. Communication within the group became intermittent. Voices in the headphones drowned in a crackle of interference. And into this chaos, another factor intervened. A human one. One of the fighters, Sliuda, the youngest in the group, made a mistake, losing concentration for just a fraction of a second, and slipped, hanging by his safety rope. But this jerk triggered a small avalanche of rocks and ice that thundered downwards. This sound was like the shot of a starting pistol. Below in the valley, searchlights flared, and the mountain, which had seemed dormant, came alive, bristling with the attention of invisible guardians. Now the task had fundamentally changed. It was no longer about installing equipment, but about saving lives, and even more importantly for the command, about maintaining secrecy at all costs. The climax came when the group reached the point marked on the map as the entrance to a technical well. But instead of a hatch, they found only smooth rock. The map was incorrect, or the landscape had changed, or, most likely, they had been led astray. At the same time, Granite's radio sprang to life, and through the noise, a voice from the mainland broke through. But instead of an order for evacuation or support, a phrase was uttered that chilled the blood faster than frost. "Object closed. Return impossible. Act according to the full isolation protocol." This meant one thing. They had been written off, abandoned. They no longer existed for the country that had sent them, to avoid an international scandal that could have erupted if they had been captured or their bodies with documents discovered. At this moment, standing on the brink of death, surrounded by the storm and betrayed by their own, they had to make a choice. Try to break through the cordons or accept their fate and disappear, leaving behind only a legend. Granite made a decision that went against instructions, but was the only correct one from a human perspective. He ordered the destruction of all equipment, all codes, everything that could identify their affiliation with intelligence, and began the descent along the most dangerous but least expected route, directly through the avalanche danger zone. It was a mad risk, an attempt to outsmart death itself. Using the fury of the elements as cover, they descended into the white haze, relying only on instincts and camaraderie, and each step was a battle with gravity. The wind roared so loudly that it seemed to be trying to shout out all the secrets of the world. Snow clogged their lungs, turning breathing into torture, but they pressed on, driven by the stubbornness of those doomed who refused to surrender without a fight. And in this struggle, something happened that could be called a miracle, or a cruel irony of fate. They triggered a snow slab avalanche, a giant layer of snow that covered not them, but the advancing enemy interception group, burying the pursuit under thousands of tons of white silence. However, victory over the pursuers did not mean salvation. Cold and exhaustion took their toll. The body's resources were depleted, and one by one, members of the group began to fade, sinking into that deceptively warm sleep from which there is no return. They remained on the slope, turning into icy statues, guardians of a secret they could never convey, and the last thing Granite saw before his consciousness dissolved into darkness were the stars, suddenly breaking through gaps in the clouds, cold, indifferent, and beautiful. In the morning, the storm subsided, and the sun illuminated the pristine slope on which there were no traces or signs of the night's drama. Only deep beneath the snow lay those who had tried to change the course of history and those who had tried to stop them, now united in common peace. In the following days and weeks, short notes appeared in European newspapers about a tragic incident in the Alps. A group of inexperienced tourists, having disregarded meteorologists' warnings, were caught in an avalanche and went missing. No names, no details, just dry lines designed to explain the presence of rescue helicopters and the closure of the area. And the world, preoccupied with its own problems, swallowed this lie without choking. Diplomatic channels remained silent, and the military departments of both sides exchanged encrypted signals confirming that the incident was closed, the status quo preserved, and no one was interested in escalation. The story was rewritten, corrected, and filed in folders marked Top Secret, to gather dust there for decades until a random climber many years later stumbled upon a strange metallic object. But this resonance, this echo of the events of 1983, still sounds today, reminding us of how fragile the world we live in is, and on what thin threads it hangs. The lesson this forgotten story teaches us is not in the tactics of sabotage groups or in the specifics of mountain warfare, but in understanding that behind major political decisions always stand specific people whose lives become bargaining chips. We live in an era where hybrid wars and covert operations are once again becoming the norm, where infrastructure, cables on the ocean floor, satellites in space, servers in permafrost, becomes a battlefield, invisible to the average person. That night in the Alps is a mirror reflecting our modernity. Technologies have changed, but the essence of conflict, the willingness to sacrifice people for abstract geopolitical interests, has remained the same. We must remember that history is not only what is written in textbooks, but also what is hidden between the lines, what remained under the snow, in the archives of special services, and in the memory of the few who knew the truth. The climber's find is not just a piece of metal, it is a witness who cannot speak, but its very presence destroys the wall of lies built around those events. It is a reminder that truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface, even if it takes half a century, even if it is bound by ice and buried under rocks. Returning to the beginning of our narrative, to the sound heard by a random passerby, we understand that it was not just the squeak of an old device, but the voice of the past, calling to the present. The circle closed. What was supposed to remain a secret forever became apparent, not through loud revelations, but through the quiet whisper of the mountains, which cannot keep human secrets forever. The Alps stand as steadfastly as they did millions of years ago. Snow still covers their peaks. But now, looking at these slopes, we see not only the beauty of nature, but also the shadows of those who walked their last path there. Their mission was not accomplished in a military sense, but philosophically, they achieved more. They became part of eternity, a warning to future generations about the price of ambition and the senselessness of enmity in the face of eternal nature. The energy of that confrontation has not disappeared. It has only transformed, dissolved into the air we breathe, become part of the cultural code that makes us look at the news with suspicion and search for a double bottom in every event. The story of the Red Storm in the Alps teaches us attentiveness, critical thinking, and perhaps compassion for those unknown executors of another's will who become hostages in big games. For in the end, when an avalanche comes down, it doesn't matter what your passport is or what flag you swore allegiance to. In the face of the elements, all are equal, and in this lies the highest, albeit cruel, justice of the universe. The plot that unfolded in those mountains demonstrates the amazing interconnectedness of all things. Just as one person's mistake can trigger an avalanche, so too can one politician's decision set off a chain reaction leading to global catastrophe. We often forget that the nuclear deterrence system, which sustained peace in the second half of the 20th century, was not a perfect mechanism, but a complex, shaky construct dependent on wires, sensors, and people sitting in bunkers or crawling across glaciers. The fact that we can discuss these events today, that the world did not burn in the fires of that autumn, is largely a result of chance, a confluence of circumstances, where the failure of one operation paradoxically prevented a greater disaster, by not allowing one side to gain an advantage that could have provoked the other to take a fatal step. Thus, the failure of the Granite Group, Their tragic end perhaps became that very fuse that did not work as the generals planned, but worked as humanity needed. Remaining there, in eternal cold, they took with them a secret that could have ignited a fire, and in this sense, their sacrifice was not in vain, though no one will ever award them medals or call them heroes. The world continued to spin, politicians continued their games, but somewhere at an altitude of 3,000 meters, a point of calm remained, a place where one small war ended, preventing a larger one from beginning. Now, as the wind once again lifts snow dust over the ridge, it seems that in its howl one can distinguish fragments of phrases, call signs, commands that no one needs to execute anymore. The mountains have been cleansed of traces of human presence, returning to their pristine wildness, and only that very strange object found by the climber remains the sole material proof that here, on the edge of the sky, a tragedy of Shakespearean scale unfolded. And every time we look at the mountain peaks, shining in the rays of the setting sun, it is worth remembering that their whiteness is deceptive, that beneath it are hidden stories of courage, fear, betrayal, and duty. Stories that did not make it into newspapers, but which shaped the world we live in today. The intelligence confrontation in those years resembled a complex chess game where the pieces were living people, and the board was the entire planet, and the Alps were just one of the squares where the interests of grandmasters converged. The peculiarity of this game was that the players did not see the entire board. They acted in the fog of war, relying on intuition and fragmentary data. And that is why the role of groups like the Granite Group was critically important and at the same time tragically vulnerable. They were the eyes and ears of the system, sent into the darkness to feel for the edge of the abyss, and often it was they who were the first to fall into that abyss, giving others a chance to stop. Delving into the details of the technical equipment of that era, one is struck by the ingenuity of the engineers who created spy equipment. Listening devices capable of picking up induction from a cable without physical connection. Autonomous transmitters disguised as rocks. Thermal insulation suits designed for space but used in the mountains. All this was the pinnacle of progress of that time, a triumph of the human mind, directed, alas, towards destruction and control. But even the most perfect technology proved powerless in the face of unforeseen circumstances, in the face of the simple fact that a battery could discharge from the cold faster than indicated in the specifications, and a microchip could crack from a pressure drop. This technological aspect adds another layer of tragedy. People relied on machines, entrusted their lives to them, but the machines failed, leaving them alone with primeval nature. It is interesting to trace how the perception of time changed among the participants of the events. If at the beginning of the operation, time was measured in hours and minutes, according to the movement schedule, then as the situation worsened, time began to stretch, losing its linearity. Minutes of waiting for communications seemed like an eternity, and hours of grueling ascent merged into one endless moment of suffering and overcoming. In conditions of hypoxia, lack of oxygen, the brain began to play with reality, mistaking wishful thinking for reality, and the boundaries between past, present, and future blurred. Surviving radio transcripts, if leaks are to be believed, contain strange pauses, illogical phrases indicating that people were in an altered state of consciousness, on the verge of madness and enlightenment, when the fear of death gives way to a strange, calm acceptance of the inevitable. In this story, there are no unequivocally bad or good characters. There are only people placed in circumstances beyond their strength, hostages of duty, and hostages of the situation. Even those who gave the order for isolation and the de facto destruction of the group acted within their logic, the logic of preserving the state, where sentimentality is considered an unforgivable luxury. This is the cruel truth of any war, hot or cold. It grinds destinies, regardless of right or wrong, and leaves behind only scars on the earth and in the memory of generations. And our task, as those living today, is not to judge them, sitting in warm armchairs, but to try to understand their motives, to feel that cold and that despair, so as not to allow such scenarios to repeat in the future. For the world has not become safer, it has only become more complex. Surveillance and destruction technologies have advanced significantly, but human nature has remained the same, and the temptation to solve complex problems by simple force has not disappeared. The Alpine incident serves as a reminder that any action begets a reaction, that any secret sooner or later comes to light, and that the cost of error in global politics can be immeasurable. We must learn to read these signs of the past, to decipher the messages left to us by those who did not return from the cold, so as not to repeat the same mistakes, only now equipped with nuclear warheads. The final chord of this story sounds not like a fanfare of victory nor a funeral march, but like silence, that very ringing silence of the high mountains that follows a storm. In this silence are hidden the answers to all questions. In it are dissolved cries and whispers, orders and prayers. In it is contained the wisdom of the mountains, which have seen thousands of such stories and will see thousands more. Man comes and goes, empires flourish and fall, borders are redrawn, but the mountains remain, indifferent witnesses to our hustle, preserving in their icy depths the memory of everyone who dared to challenge them. And perhaps this is the main lesson. The greatness of man is not in conquering nature or defeating an enemy, but in remaining human even in inhuman conditions, in preserving dignity in the face of oblivion. Thus concludes the story of the Red Storm in the Alps, of a forgotten diversion that did not make headlines but left a deep mark on the invisible history of the world. We close this page, but we do not close the topic, because history is a continuous flow, and the past is always invisibly present in the present, determining our future. May the memory of those events serve as a beacon in the fog of uncertainty, reminding us of the value of peace and the danger of playing with fire on the edge of an icy abyss.